You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. As you are probably aware by this point, we're taking a short break from episodes with our storytellers so that I can bring you up to speed on the overtures that are coming to the 2025 PCA General Assembly, which starts very soon, beginning June 23rd in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In the first episode in this special series, we covered overtures that are related to presbytery boundaries, overtures related to studies and study committees, and overtures related to the directory of worship. So you can find those in part one. And then in the second episode, we covered overtures about officers and ordination and overtures about church membership and vows. So that's all in part two. And just as a reminder, we've got links in the show notes to two resources for you, a massive post where I tried to briefly and clearly summarize each of the overtures, and then a Facebook group where you can go if you want to discuss and ask questions. So today we're going to dive into a handful of overtures that relate to the committees and agencies of the denomination. A little bit of background. As I've mentioned before, the concept of grassroots Presbyterianism is an important value in the PCA. It reflects on our history as a collection of churches that largely came out of the PCUSA, largely because of the belief that the PCUSA was liberalizing. And the founders of the PCA believed that the centralized power of the denominational committees in the mainline church was a major factor in this shift towards liberalism. And so in PCA culture, in some corners, there can be a distrust or suspicion of denominational committees and agencies, a concern about them becoming too powerful with not enough checks and oversight by local church leaders. So this plays somewhat into some of these overtures that we're seeing come up about the committees and agencies of the General Assembly. Let's start with some overtures that have been referred to the Administrative Committee for their recommendations. Overture 9 seeks to limit the voting members of the Administrative Committee to only those who have been elected by the Assembly, quote, at large. In order to understand this overture and what it would potentially change, let me take some time to explain the Administrative Committee for you. Out of 10 permanent committees and agencies in the General Assembly, the Administrative Committee is arguably the most powerful. It determines the budget for the PCA and for each of the committees and agencies. It nominates the stated clerk of the PCA, and the membership of the Administrative Committee also serves as the board of directors for the PCA as an entity in its corporate bylaws. Now let's talk about how members are currently selected for this committee. I've actually put a few diagrams in the show notes to help illustrate what I'm explaining in case you're a visual learner. So the membership of all of the other 9 permanent committees and agencies is selected in one way. Presbyteries nominate men to fill any openings on those committees. Then the nominating committee creates a slate of candidates from those nominations, and then the General Assembly votes on those slates of candidates. So membership in all of those 9 committees are all elected directly by the General Assembly. The membership for the Administrative Committee is selected in a similar way, sort of. There are a total of 20 members of the Administrative Committee. 11 of them are selected just like members in the other committees. Nomination, slate of candidates elected directly by the General Assembly, and these 11 members are called the members at large. In other words, they're elected by the General Assembly at large. However, 9 of those 20 members, the other 9, apart from the 11 at-large members, are representatives each from one of the other 9 permanent committees and agencies. So I want to offer some clarification here because there was an article circulating a while and I got some questions from folks. This article, I think it was an unintentional mistake, but this article suggested that this overture is about prohibiting lay people from having a role on the administrative committee. They suggested that perhaps permanent committees and agencies could send a representative from their committee who was a lay person to the administrative committee. That actually isn't true. None of the members of any of the other 9 permanent committees or agencies are lay people. They are all ordained officers in the PCA Church. So anybody who's sent from any of those committees is already an ordained officer. So that's not really what's in view here. This overture proposes that those representatives from the other committees, those 9 representatives, should be advisory members only. In other words, they could participate in the discussion, but not vote on any of the decisions. And so the question up for debate is whether there's a problem with allowing men who have been elected by the General Assembly at large to other committees and agencies to then have a vote when they serve as a representative of their committee on the administrative committee. So again, this directly relates to that push for grassroots control of committees and agencies. Some have argued that it's no longer necessary for permanent committees and agencies to have a representative vote on the administrative committee because after the administrative committee was formed and began functioning in the way it's currently designed, there was another committee set up called the Cooperative Ministries Committee. And I won't get into all the details of that, but it was designed to help there be cooperation and coordination between the various permanent committees and agencies. So some folks are saying, well, we already have this other group that helps coordinate between committees. So representatives from other committees to the admin committee don't really need a vote. I would argue that since the administrative committee does a whole lot more than just facilitate cooperation, indeed, it makes pretty fundamental decisions about nearly every non-ecclesiastical aspect of the PCA, the permanent committees and agencies should have a vote in these decisions. I mean, this even includes deciding the budget for those committees. The administrative committee itself is opposed to this overture. Here's a portion of their report on this overture. The current structure of the administrative committee is grounded in PCA history, with grassroots concerns addressed by our founding fathers. The PCA tried having only at-large members on the administrative committee at the beginning of its history, but found that the personalities and politics made such an arrangement counterproductive for the consistent mission and progress of the church. Those founders and leaders worked in an ad interim committee for 5 years to design a structure to protect our grassroots governance through the representation of at-large members, as well as the representation of those elected to regular oversight of the General Assembly's committees and agencies. Overture 35 is a request that the Administrative Committee study and report on locations for General Assembly. There have been challenges recently when General Assembly is held in cities that are not hubs for major airlines or that lack enough hotel and restaurant options to make attending as smooth as possible. This overture appears to have broad support, and the Administrative Committee agrees. In part, they say, post-COVID costs, recent historically high GA attendance, and even higher commissioner registration numbers required to break even make it imperative that the Administrative Committee research General Assembly arrangements as they bear on future attendance, cost, and fees that affect our General Assembly's ability to function as a truly representative body responsible for determining the doctrinal fidelity and gospel mission of the larger PCA. By way of explanation, some Presbyterian denominations have a delegated assembly. For example, in the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, each presbytery sends a certain number of representatives to the General Assembly based on the population of the presbytery, similar to how states in the United States send representatives to the U.S. House of Representatives. The PCA, however, has a representative assembly. Again, in an effort to maintain grassroots focus, every single church in the PCA is allowed to send representatives to General Assembly. This really shapes the nature of our General Assembly. So while the OPC General Assembly might have, say, 150 commissioners and be held on a college campus with commissioners staying in dorm rooms, these days, PCA General Assembly has somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 commissioners. In the past, there's been an effort to diversify the locations of General Assembly for a few reasons. For one, it enables different presbyteries to share the burden of planning and hosting the General Assembly, and it also changes up the distance that commissioners would need to travel from their respective hometowns to attend General Assembly. However, the growing size of the denomination and its annual gatherings seem to necessitate new strategies. The location for the next two General Assemblies have already been announced. In 2026, it will be in Louisville, Kentucky, and in 2027, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And after that, perhaps the administrative committee will have a new plan in place. Overture 41 requests that the administrative committee collect and report data on each congregation's meeting times on the church directory map on the administrative committee website. The administrative committee recommends that this overture be answered in the negative. As they pointed out, the interactive map already links to church websites if the church has one, and surely it would make more sense for churches to maintain their own up-to-date websites rather than needing to contact the administrative committee if the time of their services change. While the whereas statements in this overture only refer to the need to be able to prepare adequately for the Lord's Day by knowing service times, some discussion has suggested that this is also an opportunity for data gathering. In the recent past, folks have attempted to compile data about the percentage of churches in each presbytery that have Sunday evening worship services and made an argument about this being an important marker of the relative health or fidelity of a church or a presbytery. I'll just say I'm not a fan of that approach. Overtures 42 and 43 are closely related. Overture 42 requests the General Assembly to direct the stated clerk not to collect data about the age and ethnicity of members in PCA congregations. And Overture 43 suggests an amendment to the rules of assembly operation that would require the administrative committee not to collect data about age and ethnicity going forward. So apparently on the form that the administrative committee sends out each year to churches to collect data about the number of communicant and non-communicant members, there was a note that beginning in 2026, they will also be collecting data about the age and ethnicity of church members. So Overture 42 would require the stated clerk not to request that data, and Overture 43 would forbid it going forward. Here's the paragraph from RAO 4-11. And the very last sentence of this is the proposed new language. The administrative committee shall annually provide and publish guidelines for the partnership share giving program of the PCA, including the ministry ask. These guidelines shall include statistical information expressed both in per capita giving terms and in proportional percentage giving terms to demonstrate the giving necessary to attain full funding for budgets of the General Assembly committees and agencies. New sentence. Such statistical information shall not include data pertaining to age or ethnicity. The administrative committee responded with an explanation of the reasoning behind collecting both of these types of information. The data on age will help the denomination to understand and plan for the demographic needs of the congregation. And the data on ethnicity is specifically in response to an initiative put in place by the report of the Ad Interim Committee on Racial Reconciliation, which was adopted by the 45th General Assembly. In its report, the administrative committee said, the directives of the 46th General Assembly, responding to the overtures of 39 different presbyteries seeking to further racial reconciliation in our churches, instructed Mission to North America, MNA, quote, to budget and plan for renewing the research with Lifeway Research Services done in 2018, or some other research service to report back to the 51st General Assembly, 2023, in order to establish a longitudinal study of our denomination on the issue of racial reconciliation. As the study committee reported to the 45th General Assembly, the primary research objective was, quote, to obtain a quantitative baseline measure of where the Presbyterian Church in America stands on racial reconciliation. Subsequent study is required to make the baseline meaningful for longitudinal analysis, whose goal is to observe changes and trends over a period of time. Overture 44 seeks to transition by faith the denominational digital publication into a press release-based publication and limit what they publish to news as released by the presbyteries, eliminating op-ed or personal interest pieces. So, a little background here. Recently, there have been a couple of articles published by our denominational publication that caused a stir. One was an article written by a medical doctor reflecting back on COVID practices, and the other was an article which I believe recommended Karl Barth's perspective on prayer. The article no longer exists, and I'm not sure that that's accurate, but to the best of my memory, that was what the article was about. Although I've appreciated the articles published by Faith, I never really stopped to ask what the overarching purpose or stated mission of By Faith was. And so, in looking back, this is the language that the 2003 General Assembly used to authorize the Administrative Committee to establish By Faith. Quote, the mission of the PCA News Magazine is to draw readers into the full life of the church by informing, edifying, and encouraging them with the news of God's kingdom. Through feature stories, news reports, editorial opinions, readers' comments, practical information, and relevant biblical and spiritual discussion, the magazine motivates and equips readers to serve Christ in the Presbyterian Church in America and in his kingdom. The minutes of the assembly further note that the magazine would publish content, quote, examining difficult issues, personal, social, cultural, and theological, helping readers to think and speak about them biblically, always equipping them with a biblical world and life view. In other words, it was understood that every piece of content would not share unanimous agreement by every member, officer, or court of the church. And that last part I failed to mention is a quote from the Administrative Committee's report on this overture. One thing I personally have appreciated about By Faith are the times where they have published pairs of articles sharing opposing perspectives on an issue of Christian life or about an upcoming decision or overture. And I think it's also worth considering whether limiting By Faith to news only would solve the problem of this disagreement. So what counts as denominational news? Which news should be reported and which not? Anybody who has worked at all in journalism knows that there's still a great deal of discretion and decision-making involved in, quote, just publishing news. Overture 18 asks the General Assembly to require RUF, Reformed University Fellowship, which is the PCA's campus ministry program, to update their campus ministry manual for General Assembly approval. Apparently, back in 1979, when RUF was in its infancy, there was a draft of a campus ministry manual that never developed further. RUF says in their report that they do not currently have or use an RUF manual, that they are not required by the rules of assembly operation to have a manual, and even if they were required to and did have one, it isn't required to be approved by the General Assembly. Again, I think the conversation on this overture is going to come down to how much control the Assembly at large needs to have over the inner workings of our denominational committees. Overture 28 suggests that the General Assembly should, quote, demand mission to North America, MNA, to apologize and terminate personnel. In order to understand this overture and also Overture 50, which I mentioned in the first episode, you'll need a little background. As you are probably aware, there have been quite a few changes to immigration policy under the current administration in the United States. And whether you agree or disagree with the political goals of these policies, they have impacted people in our churches here in the U.S. In fact, Christianity Today covered the story of a pastor serving in one of our presbyteries in Texas who brought his family here to the U.S. from Venezuela under temporary protected status. He found out at the end of January that along with 350,000 other people from Venezuela, his TPS was being revoked and he would need to self-remove or face deportation. I've linked to the Christianity Today story in the show notes in case you want to read more. But suffice it to say, there were some presbyteries, like the one where this pastor served, who were facing complex questions of how to care for people whose legal status in the U.S. could potentially be revoked or was uncertain given the recent policy changes. So in response to these questions, an organization under the umbrella of MNA, Mission to North America, called Refugee and Immigrant Ministry, published a webpage with links to third-party organizations that provide legal advice to undocumented immigrants and refugees. For the most part, the advice on these third-party websites related to avoiding unlawful search and seizure, but one statement that garnered the most attention suggested that those whose legal status was tenuous or who were not here legally should not carry any identification that listed their country of origin. Following a social media outcry about the potential that the PCA was encouraging people to disobey the United States government, the page on the MNA website was taken down, And teaching elder Erwin Ince, the director of M&A, issued an apology. I've linked that apology in the show notes so that you can read it in full if you're interested. However, Overture 28 seeks further action. Beyond the removal of the website page and the public apology with assurances to avoid this type of error in the future, this overture calls for M&A to write an apology to the Director of Homeland Security, the Attorney General of the United States, and the Director of Citizenship and Immigration Services, in which M&A must admit that it encouraged illegal activity, write an apology to the PCA for the culture of the working environment at M&A, and terminate any employee who had any connection to the publication of this one webpage. I'll be frank, I was truly disappointed to see this overture published on the General Assembly website. Apart from any political views that could be debated, it was in poor form to propose the idea of judicial process through an overture. The determination of civil law breaking or the termination of employees from our permanent committees and agencies is not something that should be done via the passing of an overture. I really hope that commissioners to this year's General Assembly can look past the politics of immigration law and see this overture for what it is, something that would almost certainly have been ruled intemperate speech and out of order if it had been spoken on the floor of General Assembly. This brings us back around to a discussion of Overture 50. As I mentioned in the first episode, this is a bit of an unusual overture as it doesn't specifically call the PCA to do anything or propose any changes to our Book of Church Order, other than just to adopt the resolutions stated in the overture. I would encourage you to read the overture for yourself, but here are just a few of the 8 resolutions that it lists. Therefore, be it resolved that the Church should view immigrants, regardless of documentation status, primarily as neighbors and image bearers whom Christ has called us to love, evangelize, disciple, and enfold into his body, and be it further resolved that the PCA encourages its churches to speak and act towards the sojourner in ways shaped not by political rhetoric, but by the gospel, remembering our own identity as once strangers, now brought near by grace, Ephesians 2:13, and be it further resolved that when our churches and agencies interact with individuals who have no valid legal pathway to attain legal immigration status, we should exercise pastoral wisdom by advising them to obey U.S. immigrant laws, which might include voluntarily departing the U.S. for their home country, or if this would be life-threatening to a nation, if any, that might allow them legal residence. As its summary title suggests, this overture seeks to provide, quote, encouragement to discernment and compassion regarding immigrants. Some may object to this overture for political reasons, though I personally am hard-pressed to see what this overture calls us to do that isn't a clear application of Scripture. Others may object to this overture because it doesn't propose any actual action or changes. I will be interested to listen and observe the discussion about Overture 50 at General Assembly. That's all for this episode. I will be back next week with one final episode about General Assembly overtures related to the rules of discipline. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer-run and 100% donor-supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.